My name is Maureen Droney. I work with the Recording Academy, which is the membership organization behind the Grammy Awards. My job is managing the Academy's producers and engineers wing, of which I see a few of them are with us here today. It's a membership division of the Academy that has about 6,400 members who are producers and engineers and voting members of the Recording Academy. That is, they vote in the Grammy Awards. The Academy also represents the other music creators in our industry: artists, performers, songwriters, musicians, arrangers, etc. And it's those hands-on music creators who are the people who vote in the Grammy Awards. In case you don't know that, the Grammys are, by the way, the only peer-voted award show in the United States. The general public doesn't vote. It's not a consumer. It's not decided by consumers, only our members who are actually hands-on music makers. We also have members like Ken Abdo, who are managers, label people, attorneys, and others who work in the industry supporting the people who create music. But that membership group doesn't generally vote in the awards unless they have particular creative hands-on stuff going on as well, making records. Only those hands-on creators vote. So I come from an audio engineering background, so I know the importance of standards and best practices. And when I took the job I have now, one of our members, a producer, it was actually Mike Klink, Guns N' Roses producer of all their hits, right? He said to me, "Why aren't our credits available for people to see on iTunes?" So I began to try to figure out why. I mean, how hard could it be? We saw our credits on vinyl albums and on CDs, even though they're very small on CDs, but why don't we see them now? Well, it's complicated, of course, and the reasons are many, from the way recordings are made today to how we listen to them, often on tiny screens where there just isn't much room. But in the digital age, not having visible credits is a bigger problem than just musicians and engineers getting jobs from people who see their credits and like their work, even though that's huge. The availability of credits, knowing who did what and who needs to be paid, how much by whom, is supremely important. And I know you all know this by now. So in my quest to help our members get the recognition they deserve and the payments they have a right to, I was profoundly affected by two quotes. One was from the legendary and visionary producer Phil Ramone, who said to me, it must have been over 10 years ago, "To make a living from the digital music world, we're going to have to figure out how to get paid properly what we're owed from the fractions of pennies that are collected from a crazy amount of sources all over the world." The other quote was from an executive at Spotify, maybe 6 years ago. He said, "We'd love to show credits. We think it would make better playlists, it would help discovery, and it would improve the overall listener experience." But then he also said, "But we can't take the crediting information from all sorts of different companies around the world in different formats. We need to receive it from everyone in the same way, which means in standardized, computerized machine language." Which leads us to DDEX, Digital Data Exchange, of which, and Mark Isherwood, who's going to be taking over in a couple minutes here, doesn't love this when I say it. I'm its biggest, and I'm DDEX's biggest and unpaid evangelist. Because DDEX is the only international organization making standards, open standards, for the business side of the music. Not audio or video standards like SMPTE or the AES, the Audio Engineering Society, but the business side of music, making it possible for the standardized exchange of information about recordings from their creation in the studio, hence credits, to the labels, the DSPs, Spotify, Pandora, YouTube, etc., and then back again with sales and usage reports. Mark will explain how this works, but being a reticent Brit, he may not talk about what an extraordinary group of people comprise DDEX. From so many different companies, the labels, publishers, numerous startups, and Spotify, Google, Cobalt, Amazon, Apple, SoundCloud, Sound Exchange, pretty much everybody in the digital supply chain. You can check it out on DDEX.net. Everybody, pretty much now, it's grown so much that everybody who is anybody in the digital music supply chain now belongs, and they work together to solve the intricate communication challenges of our industry. I joined as an individual member because I was intrigued to learn how all this worked. I got the Recording Academy to join because among all the influential companies who are part of DDEX'S, there was no company that represented creators themselves. So I'm proud to say that the Recording Academy does that. And I'm also very proud to be part of the extraordinary work that DDEX'S and its members have done and continue to do. So let me introduce Mark, a founding persona of DDEX'S. DDEX'S has 123 members, those companies I mentioned, and a board of directors. But the day-to-day work is done by a relatively small group of hardworking people in operations, IT, management, including two who manage all of this. And being British, they're called the Secretariat. And one of them is my friend here. One of those two is my friend here, Mark Isherwood. As his bio says, and you can read the full thing on the MusicTech site, Mark was a senior manager for what became the UK Collecting Society, PRS for Music, which is, of course, one of the biggest collecting societies in the world. He developed strategies and policies for rights and licensing. He also led a team that examined the intellectual property rights consequences of using Creative Commons. And among other things, he was the chair of the working group that made the first major attempt to create a global repertoire database. You can imagine how much he learned from that. So Mark then became involved in the early industry discussions on the creation and development of DDEX'S. And he's led the Secretariat since DDEX'S was incorporated. So thanks for listening to my story, and over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Maureen, very much. I now know what it feels like to have double cream poured all over you. So thanks for that. I seem to have lost the screens at the moment, but I'm assuming you can still see me because there's a little green light in front of me, and hopefully hear me. So DDEX'S has now been around for coming up to 14 years. And hopefully, as most of you will know now, our focus is on developing communications standards, or the standards around the process of communicating metadata. I was a little embarrassed to see that this session was called Metadata in one word, because frankly, that would take up a whole year of conferences, not just half an hour. So I'm just going to be focusing on a couple of the standards that DDEX'S have fairly recently published. And there are sort of three elements to all of these standards. One is the actual format, which is, if you like, the order in which the fields on the message appear and how they interact. The second is the choreographies, which is the way in which messages are exchanged, and defining the triggers that say, you know, if X happens, then business partner B must send X message to business partner A, and so on and so forth. And then the actual protocols, the actual mechanisms by which the messages are exchanged. At the moment, or as a result of recent publications, we now have 8 families of standards, and one way or another, they cover pretty much the whole supply chain, right from the studio all the way through to collective rights organizations and the people that they represent, and including distributors and metadata companies. But the two I wanted to focus on today are probably a little bit more interesting in that it's about data beyond the simple rights management supply chain stuff. The first of these is called the Media Enrichment and Description Standard. And this is one that is generally going to be sent from a record company or a distributor to a DSP. And it may also come from a metadata company, of which there are an increasing number, big and small. So we obviously know of companies like Gracenote, but then there are lots of small companies like Music Story that are doing similar types of things. And the second one that I want to talk about is the Recording Information Notification Standard, which is one that Maureen was very, very heavily involved in getting done. And basically this is more of a file format than a message, but it's tended as a mechanism for gathering data as early in the creation process as possible, namely in the studio. And so that it can flow throughout the full value chain as the process of creation continues. So if we first look at the MEAD standard, the Media Enrichment and Description, as we all know, as digital music came along, we started with small screens on iPods, progressed to something slightly bigger on phones and iPads, and even now, obviously, on laptops. What we now have a lot of is speakers that don't have screens. And so we can't see any of the data. And it makes it much harder for the artificial intelligence driving the music services to actually interact with us and we with them. And obviously part of that is us as humans asking a number of questions in the hope of getting the response that we're looking at. And some of the things that we looked at were questions like, Google, play something from Slowhand, or Siri, play me my Ed Sheeran's latest track, or Cortina, play me something from the female singer on the live version of Don't Give Me Up. And if we take that last example, in order for the AI to actually be able to respond correctly, there's a number of things that need to be in place. First of all, there needs to be a list of the popular tracks that are called Don't Give Me Up. There needs to be a differentiation between live and studio versions. There needs to be a clear indication of gender with regard to the lineups of the people that have performed on live and studio versions of Don't Give Me Up. And you need to identify, as a consequence, identify female singers, and then find another track that singer was on. And so you need to be able to differentiate between Kate Bush, that performed originally with Peter Gabriel, and then Alicia Keys, who did a version, I think, with Bono, and there are one or two other female singers who've done versions of Don't Give Me Up. And so the AI needs all that information in order to be able to provide what you want. And a slightly simpler example with the Ed Sheeran's latest track, the latest one may not actually be the one that has been most recently released. And the AI that supports these services needs to be aware of that. The obvious data sources for this type of information is mainly from record companies, both their supply chain systems, but also from their marketing systems, because a lot of the types of data that provide you the information you need for the example I gave just now are not part of the rights management part of their systems or the supply chain. They're very much marketing information. And other sources, as I've already mentioned, are third-party metadata providers, and we have a number of those within DDEX'S. And so in order to accommodate the need for the exchange of this type of data, which is really outside of basic supply chain and rights management data, we've created the Media Enrichment and Description standard. It can be provided as part of a release delivery feed, so that is the rights management and the supply chain data, or separately as part of a separate feed. And this information can be, or these messages can be exchanged using standard secure FTP, or we hope in due time, much more through web services as we move towards more automation. There are essentially two ways in which MEAD messages can be sent to DSPs. One is a proactive mode, whereby you just send a MEAD file to the DSP directly. Either the label does that, or a metadata service provider does that, or you can set up a system whereby you have a link into a database and simply ask questions of that database and get data sent back. The first version of Mead doesn't contain that, but that is one of the things that's in the work plan going forward. And essentially what Mead supports is various different attributes relating to parties. That is obviously the people that participated in the recording, the work that is part of that recording, the sound recording, and the products that it may be on. So that includes things like the influence and the similarity that exists between one track and another, the vocal register, biographies, obviously photos is a obvious clear example, lyrics, mood, styles, genre, all of these things can appear in a Mead message in relation to those four categories: the party, the work, the resource, or the release. And that's obviously the sort of data that is being exchanged. The standard was published at the back end of last year, and we are expecting some real live implementations Q3 or 4 of this year. The second standard I want to talk about is the Recording Information Notification Standard. As many of you will know, most of the standards that DDEX'S has created are really business to business. And the question has to arise, well, where does all that data originate from, so that labels, publishers, distributors, DSPs, copyright management, collective management organizations can actually exchange this data? Well, essentially the answer is from the studios. And that is really what RIN is all about. As I said, it's more of a file format. And what it enables is metadata to be captured at the point of creation. And then that metadata file can go with the actual binaries themselves to the next process that may take place. Whether it's just adding the backing vocals or just adding the rhythm section or whatever it happens to be, that metadata goes with the files, and then it kind of acts like a bucket, so that as all of these processes have gone through in the creation of an ultimately sound recording for release to the public, then more and more data gets added, and eventually when it is fed into the supply chain, that means there's a lot more data available for all of the businesses within the industry to actually get the data that they need. And basically it's describing all kinds of things like worker and writer, the artists, obviously, the instruments used, the engineers, the equipment that was used, and a whole range of other things, where and when obviously the recording session took place. And as I've explained, we see the use of RIN more as a cycle, in that as something is composed or recorded or mixed or mastered, metadata is added, the metadata moves on with the binaries themselves, and then these can feed into the supply chain. The most obvious place is it going to labels and perhaps distributors, where they then convert the data that they've got after all the relevant double checking, of course, into a release delivery message, which they then send on to DSPs. But it covers a whole bunch of other players in the industry as well. And DDEX'S is working with a number of digital audio workstation manufacturers to encourage them to adopt RIN within their systems. And there is also work going on within some of the record companies and the collective management organizations to be able to ingest RIN files. And so hopefully this will be a way of improving the collection of metadata at the source, which has been so much of a problem we found, particularly during the digital era. So those were the comments that I wanted to make. I'm very happy if I could see you, I'd be even happier to take any comments. But I said I seem to have lost the lost that screen, and I don't quite know why. So I don't know, Maureen, if there's anything else you want to cover as a result of that.
No, you don't have that gorgeous chart that shows how the DDEX standards cover the whole industry that you could put up, do you?
Well, I do, but I don't. As I said, there's something going wrong with the machinery. Always blame the tools, never yourself.
It's a beautiful flow chart with all the arrows showing how the data can travel from the studio all the way to the DSPs and back again with sales and usage reports. So
I don't know if
and that DDEX standards actually cover all of that now. So
yeah, so I mean, I don't know if somebody can put my computer on screen. Then I've got that up now, but as the famous tube map, it uses the style of the London tube map that you may have seen, and we did get permission to do that, by the way. And it just shows all the interconnections between the different major players in the industry and the nature of the standard that those companies would be adopting and using as part of their supply chain work.
So I guess you'll have to take my word for it, or is it on DDEX.net?
Yeah, it is. It's on the website. Yeah.
So it's.
You actually, I think, Mark, why don't you try to share at the bottom? Can you share your screen?
Well, the trouble is I can't actually find the Zoom window at the moment. It seems to have disappeared.
Yeah, that's what happened to me too. I assume that's what's happening to everyone. I just saw you,
Okay.
not myself or the room. So, is that what you're seeing, Mark?
I'm not seeing anything. I can't find the window with
right.
Zoom in it, which is about as helpful as a chocolate teapot, I'm afraid. But there you go.
So I was just we just played to whatever was in front of us.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I've noticed I've noticed that issue too. For the past couple days. I'm fine now, but sadly I don't exactly know how to fix it. So I apologize.
I hope you found this interesting. And I think the big word for DDEX from as long as I've been in it is implementation, getting implementations. These standards exist, and the more entities that implement them. There actually was a study done, right, Mark, at one point about there are costs to do a major implementation at something like a major label, but within how many years?
Yeah.
3 years? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that. In fairness, that was a long time ago, but we did a study and across the board, it wasn't just labels, and the indications are that over a period of 3 years, you're making about 60% saving because you're using one format instead of a whole variety of them. Obviously, that varies from company to company, but you know the value of going to standards, and I'm sure that that's now much greater because of the volume of transactions and the volume of data that has to be exchanged as a consequence. Are there any questions? As I said, I can't see them on chat, but I'm sure somebody could decipher them for me if there are any.
Well, actually, we can do a breakout room. You'll get an invitation to a breakout room here in just a minute as soon as this is over. If you guys want to continue that conversation.
Yeah, I see a question here. Some distributors, like for example, DistroKid, require artists to strip metadata from media files before sharing them. Is there a movement to start supporting these standards natively? I can tell you that our producers and engineers wing members in our San Francisco chapter are actually doing a study of the independent distributors and what they accept metadata wise, as well as file size, you know, whether it's a high res file or an MP3 of certain size. So they're doing comparisons of them. It's kind of a moving target because things change all the time, but we're trying to figure out who's doing what and then instigate those conversations with them about the things that can happen to make it easier to show more information about the recordings. Mark, it looks like you have something to say.
Yeah, I mean, the purpose of DDEX is that the metadata doesn't need to be in the actual binaries themselves. That it's supposed to go with the binaries to the distributor or directly to the DSP if that's what's happening. And you know, I don't know the distro kids because they're not members of DDEX, so I don't know them. But I know that a number of the distributors actually have quite high bars that they expect their clients to reach in terms of the quality of the metadata they provide. Doesn't always work, but at least they're trying to do something to raise people's awareness of the importance of getting that data right and of a high quality. So there are no silver bullets for this issue, and there never have been, and frankly, there never will be. It's just a grind to just keep on trying to improve the situation. And what DDEX does and what other organizations do who are in this space, other standards, particularly identification standards, everybody's pushing to improve the quality of what they do so that everything joins together and produces a better result at the end.
But Mark, when you, the words you're using, binaries, are you talking about the music file, the song
actual
file?
files, yeah.
Like example for RIN, they're separate. The idea was always that the data didn't have to travel with the music. It didn't have to travel with the music file. There's reasons you wouldn't want it to, security, all sorts of things, but they're linked together by unique identifiers such as ISRC, ISWC, and ISNI, the unique identifiers that identify people and recordings and musical works, songs. So they're tied together with it so that the data doesn't actually have to be, and it often isn't advisable to be, included in the song file.
No, and it could travel, but it would be a separate file.
Yeah.
Could travel with the audio files themselves, but yeah, there is no need for it to be in the file itself. And actually, given the amount of data that is required in order to do decent supply chain management and rights management, it's way too much anyway to go in the file. So there isn't any real benefit in doing that.